Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 106th deck and it's titled Reanimator and Gruul. It's more likely than you think. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So first off, before we get into the actual deck tech, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts and some great ways to help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So first off, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13. You can send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you're ever interested in reaching out, you have questions, you just want to chat, those are all great ways to do it. And last but not least, if you're interested in supporting the channel a little bit more directly, you can, of course, head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there, you get access to things like the deck lists a week early. You can get access to a Discord channel where we actually brew up some of the decks and also play some of the games. So if you've ever wanted to be on the channel, that's a great way to do it. You'll get a card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. It will be one of our random cards of the week as well. And last but not least, you'll get access to the unedited gameplay videos. And of course, I said last but not least, but there is one last thing, what I consider to be the most important thing. That is the ability to take any of your cards that you suggest and make sure that they are guaranteed to turn into a video. I am more than happy to take suggestions from anyone, and of course I love to do so, but I can't guarantee that they will be turned into videos for anyone but our patrons. I of course get a lot of suggestions, so I have to make sure that our patrons get first priority. So if that is something you are interested in, please do head on over to patreon.com. It's not super expensive. We have very different tiers, but I do understand that it can be tough to financially support someone every single month. So if that's not your style, or maybe it's just not the right time for you, you can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. Now, the last thing we got to do before moving on to the actual deck tech is, of course, shouting out our 5 current patrons. We've got William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Calvin Schmidt, and Jeff Winger. To the 5 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's get into our deck tech. So first up, we got to talk about our random card of the week. This one was suggested to us by Doodle over on Patreon/Discord. And the card that he suggested to us was Aether Rift. So I'll be honest, I had never even heard of this card before he suggested it, but Aether Rift is 1 red-green for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, discard a card at random from your hand. If you discard a creature card this way, put that card into play unless any player pays 5 life. Now, there's a very good chance that we will probably just be doing 5 damage with this card. I can't imagine most people will let us reanimate creatures for free, but you never know. Maybe we can kind of make some friends. So that is going to be our random card. And to play along with this theme, we are sticking into the Gruul colors with our commander and kind of playing up the random discard theme by playing Gallia of the Endless Dance. So Gallia is red and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature satyr. She's got haste. Other satyrs you control get +1/+1 and have haste. And whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may discard a card at random. If you do, draw 2 cards. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. This is not a satyr deck, so if you're here for satyrs, I do apologize. That's not what we're doing. But we do want to make sure that we are taking advantage of her second ability to discard cards. What's better than just discarding cards and drawing cards? It's discarding cards, drawing cards, and then reanimating the creatures that we've discarded. So we are going to focus pretty heavily on playing a Reanimator deck in the Gruul colors, which is not the traditional colors for Reanimator. Usually you see black, sometimes white. So we're going to try it in red and green and see what we can come up with. So with that being said, we of course got to take a look at some themes. You can probably guess a few of them already. The first one being discard. We got to make sure that we can put all of the stuff that we want to get back into our graveyard. So we are running a lot of cards like Bitter Reunion, which is 1 and a red for an enchantment. When Bitter Reunion enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. Then you can also pay 1 and sacrifice Bitter Reunion. Creatures you control gain haste until the end of turn. The most important part of this card is, of course, the discarding a card, and because this one is not random, we can pick and choose which card we're throwing away at any given time, so hopefully we can get the most use out of it in the future. And we have a ton of cards that do this, stuff that we discard a card to draw 2, maybe discard a card to draw 2 or make some treasure tokens. We have plenty of ways to get the cards we want into the graveyard. And I wanted to highlight Bitter Reunion here because it also can give our creatures haste if that's something we need at any given time. So of course, since we're discarding cards, our next theme leads us into bringing those cards back. We want to make sure that we are getting use out of the cards in our graveyard, particularly the creatures in our graveyard. That is where something like Reincarnation comes in, which is 1 green for an instant. Choose target creature. When that creature dies this turn, return a creature card from its owner's graveyard to the battlefield under the control of that creature's owner. So this isn't straight up revival or reincarnation or reanimation, whatever you want to call it, but it's very conditional, and in green and red, honestly, that's pretty good. We will take what we can get. So since this requires a creature to die, we're going to be in combat quite a bit. It's not out of the ordinary that we just attack or block and then use reincarnation in the middle of combat, but we can also find ways to sometimes sacrifice our own creatures to make sure that we can trigger reincarnation whenever we want to. So yeah, it's not super great. It's kind of conditional, still 3 mana, but it is instant speed, and honestly, that's pretty good for what we're trying to do. And then finally, we get into our last theme, which are the creatures we want to be bringing back. Most of the time, we're just bringing back huge creatures. It doesn't really matter what they do, but I wanted to hone in on one specific creature type, which is phoenixes, because they actually bring themselves back more than anything else. So even while our reanimation spells aren't super great, we have creatures that can bring themselves back, and that is pretty relevant to what we're trying to do with this deck. So for example, we have Sunstreak Phoenix, which is 2 red for a 4/2 Phoenix. It's got flying. If it's neither night nor day, it becomes day as Sunstreak Phoenix enters the battlefield. Then, whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, we can pay 2 mana, and if we do, we return the Phoenix from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is one of the cheaper abilities on this. A lot of our reanimation Phoenixes tend to cost either a little bit more money or require us to be attacking. So the fact that we can trigger this on our opponent's turns when our opponents are casting spells or not casting spells is very relevant. And there are a ton of other Phoenixes. We want to make sure that we can return our creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, so Phoenixes are perfect at doing that. But those are our themes for the deck, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that, while they may not necessarily always be win conditions, they are usually very good at what our game plan is and what we are trying to accomplish. So the first of those key cards is going to be Genesis, which is 4 and a green for a 4/4 creature incarnation. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, you may pay 2 and a green. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, it is unfortunate Genesis does not return it to the battlefield, but this is one of those cards that we are happy to discard. We are happy to get it out of our hand, because once it's no longer in our hand, we can keep getting creatures back every single turn, putting them straight into our hand, recasting them. Maybe they die. That's okay. We'll just get them back. So Genesis really does everything we want it to do. And most importantly, it does those things from the graveyard. It does not have to be in play for us to be getting our cards back. So Genesis is a great value engine that just really never keeps on giving. And then we have our second key card, which is going to be Nim Deathmantle. Now, if you're anything like me, when you first saw Nim Deathmantle, you kind of assumed it couldn't be in this deck because, I mean, it's turning things into black zombies. It probably has a black pip somewhere on it, right? But Luckily for us, it doesn't. This is a purely colorless card, so we can run it in this deck. So Nim Deathmantle is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has Intimidate, and is a black zombie. Whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 4. If you do, return that card to the battlefield and attach Nim Deathmantle to it. So as long as any of our creatures die and we have 4 mana, we can just automatically get them back into play. That's not necessarily Reanimator, but it's very powerful, and it still does trigger some of the things that care about our creatures going to and from the graveyard. The other reason this is going to be so important for us is because we are most likely going to have a very threatening board presence. We're going to have a ton of creatures. They're all going to be pretty big, so there's a good chance our opponents are going to want to wipe our board. We don't have a ton of protection from board wipes, but Nim Deathmantle, while very expensive, is a protection from board wipes because this triggers for every creature that goes to the graveyard, even if they all happen at the same time. So if we have 3 creatures go to the graveyard, we could technically pay 12 mana, which I know is a ton of mana, but we're in Gruul. There's a good chance we'll have a bunch of it. And we can return all 3 of those creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield, putting Nim Deathmantle on the one that was most recently activated. So it's going to be very relevant to protect us from board wipes, or at least protect a couple of key creatures to make sure that we are doing what we want to do and keeping our board around at the same time. So that is key card number 2, and it actually plays very well into key card number 3 because the third key card we want to talk about is Flayer of the Hatebound. So Flayer of the Hatebound is 5 and a red for a 4/2 creature devil. Has Undying, so whenever it dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, it returns to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. This is incredibly powerful in our deck because that's exactly what we want to be doing. We want to be putting creatures from the graveyard into the battlefield. So if we use Nim Deathmantle, we would see a creature, maybe say Genesis, die, it comes back, then it's got 4 power, so it just does 4 damage to anything. That could be our opponents, creatures. I think it's been errated to say planeswalkers, but I'm not 100% sure on that, so you might want to double check me. So Flayer of the Hatebound is perfect for what we're trying to do because it adds a little bit of reach to our deck. We no longer have to win through combat damage, we can win through non-combat damage, which gets around some annoying creatures like Spore Frog or Kami of False Hope or even just fogs in general. So Flayer of the Hatebound, perfect for what we're doing. Gives us some reach, and it's not a bad body on its own. A 4/2, yeah, it's 6 mana, but let's be honest, we don't want to be casting this card, we want to be reanimating it. So that is the last of our key cards, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are some cards that work very well together and synergize very well together, but sometimes they're also just cards I want to highlight because I think they're kind of cool and we don't get to talk about them too much. So the first pair of cards that I want to talk about are going to be Feldon of the Third Path and Moldgraf Monstrosity. So Feldon of the Third Path, one of our few, not necessarily true reanimators, but repeatable reanimators. And that is 1 red for a 2/3 legendary creature human artificer. 2 and a red, tap, create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. One of the things that's really important about Feldon that I missed when I first read this card is that it doesn't exile the creature card that you target in your graveyard. You actually get to keep the card there and keep making tokens of it. And so that actually pairs very well with Moldgraf Monstrosity, which is 4 green for an 8/8 insect. It's got trample, but when Moldgraf Monstrosity dies, exile it, then return 2 creature cards at random from your graveyard to the battlefield. If we make a token copy of the Monstrosity with Feldon and we attack with it, it's an 8/8 with trample. It's probably not going to die in combat, but even if it does, that's not super relevant. And then at the next end step, we sacrifice it, we trigger the Monstrosity. When it dies, it tries to exile it, There's nothing to exile since it's a token, but it doesn't matter because we still get the ability. So we will then return 2 creature cards at random from our graveyard to the battlefield. Maybe we get the real Moldgraph Monstrosity that's in our graveyard. Maybe we don't. Either way, we're not super worried because next turn, if we don't get the Moldgraph, we can just do this again. We can repeatedly trigger Feldon and Moldgraph Monstrosity, getting 2 creatures back every single turn, essentially for only 3 mana. And that is incredibly powerful when we don't have a ton of reanimation in our deck, or at least repeated reanimation. So getting permanently back 2 creatures every single turn is very, very powerful, especially because when the creatures die, they don't get exiled. They just go straight back to the graveyard, and we can repeat the process again and again and again. Maybe at some point we hit the Moldgraph Monstrosity and it does actually have to come back to the battlefield. That's okay, because now if the real one dies, we just keep the train going. So a very cool interaction between these 2 cards, and both of them are very, very powerful in this deck because what else are we going to do besides reanimate big creatures and keep swinging? So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 is going to look a little bit different. That is going to be between Goblin Anarchomancer and Vengevine. So Goblin Anarchomancer is a red and a green for a 2/2 Goblin Shaman. Each spell you cast that's red or green costs 1 less to cast. And we're going to pair that up with Vengevine, which is 2 green for an elemental, 4/3 with haste. Whenever you cast a spell, if it's the second creature spell you cast this turn, you may return Vengevine from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, Goblin Anarchomancer does technically make Vengevine cheaper. We still don't really want to be casting it for 3 mana. It's a 4/3 with haste, which isn't bad, but we really want to be getting it technically, quote unquote, for free. And by doing that, we can just put Vengevine in our graveyard and use Goblin Anarchomancer to cast 2 creatures in 1 turn, which is going to be a lot easier since they're both going to cost 1 less to cast, presumably. And then we get Vengevine back for a lot cheaper than we would have otherwise, because we do have a lot of 2 to 3 mana creatures that we can just cast one after the other, get Vengevine back, and we've probably still paid a lot less mana with Goblin Anarchomancer than we would have otherwise. So while these 2 don't synergize directly with each other super well, one of them is going to help cast the other one, and then the other one's going to help protect the other one. So Anarchomancer and Vengevine are kind of, I was going to say best friends. I don't know if they would be best friends, but they're at least pretty good friends. They are okay acquaintances at least. So Goblin Anarchomancer, great on its own. Vengevine, great on its own. Together, pretty solid. So that leads us to the end of our cool interactions. The next piece of this, probably the one that most people tend to look forward to the most, is the price. This deck actually came in pretty cheap, $77.69, and while that is solid $23 under our budget limit, you're going to be even more surprised by the budget when we talk about the most expensive card in the deck, because that is Portal to Phyrexia, which is a massive $19.44. So if you decided you needed to trim the price of the deck, just by cutting this one card, you can get it down to a little under $60, which is a massive improvement from $77. However, if you are able to keep Portal to Phyrexia in here, maybe you were lucky enough you pulled one during Brothers War, you just have an extra one laying around, it is going to be very good in this deck because it is 9 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures. That on its own is a pseudo board wipe. Phenomenal. Then, at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So just like some of the other cards we've talked about, like Feldon, this does not exile the card. We get the card straight out of the graveyard. It doesn't exile when it dies, so we can keep doing this over and over. But this is repeatable reanimation once a turn from anyone's graveyard. That is exactly what we are looking for in this deck, and while that's incredibly hard to come by, which is why Portal to Phyrexia is a massive $19, it's very good in the deck. So if you are able to include it in the deck, I highly recommend it, but if you do have to cut it, I completely understand. It trims you down to about $60, which is much more manageable. So With all of that out of the way, the next piece of this conversation is to talk about what I would throw into this deck to improve it. What are some out-of-budget upgrades? And if I'm being perfectly honest, this was the first deck when I couldn't think of any. I struggled to find a card that I would throw into the deck that didn't quite fit, because if I could include Portal to Phyrexia and still have $23 left over, I could kind of include anything I wanted. And the problem with that is I couldn't think of anything that I wanted that wasn't just a generic staple. So yeah, I could say you should throw in like a Dockside Extortionist or, maybe an Oracle of Moldiah or something like that, but none of that felt in theme with the deck, and so it didn't feel like it was going to be an upgrade for this deck specifically, in the way that it was just kind of an upgrade for Gruul decks in general, and I didn't want to do that. So if you can think of a card that you think would go well in this deck that I am not thinking of or wasn't included in the deck list, or you can think of an out-of-budget upgrade, please do let me know, because I would love to hear all of the cards that you think should be in this deck, because like I said, I don't have any great suggestions other than just staples or other big beefy creatures. And again, that doesn't quite feel like it's in the theme of the deck. So I suppose, with all of that being said, the very last thing we're going to have to do with this deck is see how it performs in a game. And in this case, we are seeing how it performs in 2 separate games. So we are going to run up against 2 separate pods, against 3 different opponents in each pod, and see how this deck performs. Our first game here is going to be against Shawn, playing his Nayeth of the Dire Hunt deck. We have McRae playing their Niv-Mizzet Reborn with Jegantha the Wellspring as a companion, and then we have Bilal playing Aurelia the War Leader. So this pod honestly looks terrifying from the outside. Shawn's Nayeth deck he is very happy with. This is one of his newest decks. This is about fighting things. His goal is to play the biggest Gruul creatures he can and just kind of fight down his opponent's stuff, draw cards, make his stuff super big. So I'm very interested in this deck because it sounds like my style of deck. So I'm very interested to see what he does, and I'm kind of hoping our creatures can be a little bit bigger than his, but we'll see. I suppose worst case scenario, he fights our creatures and we just reanimate them anyway. Next up, McRae's Niv-Mizzet deck. This is, from what they have said, kind of like a Ravnica style deck. So they want to be playing a ton of cards that are exactly 2 color pairs, which does lead to a lot of Ravnica cards. And there's also a gate sub-theme, so they want to play as many gates as possible and try to win through Maze's End. So I'm very interested to see how that goes. So, of course, we've got Niv-Mizzet, and then on the companion side of things, we also have Jegantha. I don't think Jegantha's in here for anything more than just it could be in the deck, so you might as well throw it in there. But I could be wrong. Maybe there's some kind of combo with Jegantha that I'm not thinking of. Either way, I'm very excited to see the deck. I love Ravnica, so I think it'll be super cool. And then finally, we have Bilal playing his Aurelia the War Leader deck, and this is a deck that out of all the decks at the table, I am probably the most scared of. I have actually lost to Bilal's Aurelia deck before. I know that he plays the Sword of Hearth and Home, which can actually go infinite with Aurelia, give him infinite combat steps. So I am a little concerned about that one. Hopefully that's not something that shows up in this game. But I do think that because we have a ton of Phoenixes, we can probably at least block Aurelia pretty effectively and even possibly outrace her. So we'll see how it goes. I am very excited for this game. I hope you all are as well, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by McRae, myself, and then Bilal. On Shawn's first turn, he plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. McRae plays a Simic Guildgate. I play a Command Tower, and then cast Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards. Bilal plays a Plains, casts a Soul Ring, casts a Chrome Mox, exiling Doomscar so that it taps for white, and then passes. Shawn plays a Forest and casts Swiftfoot Boots. McRae plays a Boros Guildgate. I play an Exotic Orchard, then cast Goblin Anarchomancer, making all my green and red spells cost 1 less to cast. Bilal plays a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1, then casts a Boros Signet, and also casts a fighter class, searching his library for an equipment, putting it into his hand. In this case, he gets a Sword of Feast and Famine. Shawn plays a forest and casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. McRae plays an island, and then casts Kiora's Follower, which they can tap to untap target permanent. I play a mountain and cast my commander Gallia of the Endless Dance. Then, since she's got haste, I decide to attack Bilal with both of my creatures for 4 total damage. On Bilal's turn, he plays a mountain and casts his commander Aurelia the War Leader, which allows him to get an extra combat step the first time she attacks each turn. Then, since she also has haste, he attacks me for 3, getting another combat step, and then attacks me for 3 again. Shawn plays a forest and casts his commander, Neith of the Dire Hunt, letting him draw a card when his creatures fight or become blocked, and also pay 3 mana at the beginning of combat to double target creature's power and force an opponent to block it this turn if able. Then he also casts a Findhorn Elves and passes. McRae plays a mountain and casts Circuitous Route, searching their library for 2 gates, putting them into play tapped. Notably, they get Baldur's Gate and Gond Gate, so their gates come into play untapped. Then they activate Kiora's Follower to untap Simic Guildgate, and, at the end of turn, I cast Thrill of Possibilities, discarding a card and drawing 2. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast a Rekindling Phoenix, which creates a 0/1 elemental token when it dies, allowing me to sacrifice it in my upkeep to return the Phoenix from my graveyard to the battlefield with haste. Then I move to combat, and since I now control a creature with power 4 or greater, I pay a red mana to return Flamewake Phoenix from my graveyard to the battlefield, and since the Phoenix has to attack, I send it at Shawn for 2. Bilal plays a Plains and levels up his fighter class, making all of his equip abilities cost 2 less. Then he casts the Sword of Feast and Famine, equipping it to Aurelia for free, giving her +2/+2, protection from green, protection from black, makes an opponent discard a card when she deals combat damage to them, and also lets Bilal untap all his lands when she deals combat damage to an opponent. He then attacks me with Aurelia for 5, getting an extra combat step after this one, and I block the damage with the Rekindling Phoenix, making an elemental token. Unfortunately, this doesn't stop the next attack as Bilal hits me for 5 with Aurelia, making me discard a card while he untaps all of his lands. Then, in his second main phase, he levels up Fighter class to level 3, letting him force target creature to block any of his attacking creatures if able. Shawn plays a forest and casts Gruul Rage Beast, having it fight my Flamewake Phoenix when it enters, drawing Shawn a card. Then he accidentally plays another forest, forgetting he's already played one, but none of us catch that at the time. At the end of turn, McRae casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing an island to search their library for a Field of the Dead, putting it into play. Then, on McRae's turn, they cast a Merciless Eviction, exiling all creatures. Once that's resolved, they play an island, triggering Field of the Dead, making a 2/2 zombie token, and then also cast Radha Heart of Keld, letting them play lands from the top of their library. On my turn, I play a mountain, and then flashback Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards. Bilal plays a mountain and casts a Blade Historian, giving his attacking creatures double strike. He also casts Jeweled Lotus, immediately sacrificing it to recast his commander Aurelia, and then immediately equips her with the Sword of Feast and Famine and attacks me for 5, which becomes 10 thanks to double strike, gaining an additional combat after this. While I'm unable to prevent Aurelia from knocking me out, I can at least force Bilal to use both his combat steps to do it, so I cast Cathartic Pyre, doing 3 damage to the Blade Historian, killing it, taking only 5 damage, and then dying to Bilal's second attack for another 5. This does, though, make me discard 2 cards, while Bilal untaps all of his lands and knocks me out of the game. Shawn casts a Soul Ring, and then recasts his commander Neith, immediately equipping her with the Swiftfoot boots, giving her haste and hexproof. McRae casts Rakdos Charm, destroying Bilal's Sword of Feast and Famine, then pays 3 to put Jengatha the Wellspring from Companion Zone into their hand. Bilal casts a Reconstruct History, returning Sword of Feast and Famine from his graveyard to his hand, recasting it and re-equipping it to Aurelia for free. He then attacks McRae for 5 with Aurelia, getting an additional combat step, making them discard a card and untapping all of Bilal's lands, and then Bilal attacks them for 5 more damage, making McRae discard another card while Bilal untaps his lands a second time. On Shawn's turn, he cast Worldly Tutor, searching his library for a creature, in this case a Reclamation Sage, putting it on top of his deck. He then cast Prey Upon, making Nerith fight McRae's zombie token, killing it and letting Shawn draw a card. This draws him the Reclamation Sage, which he's able to cast, destroying the Sword of Feast and Famine when it enters. After that, he casts a Fierce Empath, searching his library for a creature, mana value 6 or greater, putting it into his hand, letting him get an Elder Gargaroth. McRae plays a Cliffgate, naming green so it taps for red or green mana, making a zombie token as well. They then cast their commander, Niv-Mizzet Reborn, revealing the top 10 cards of their library, putting one of each color pair into their hand. In the end though, this only gets them a Culling Ritual and a Fire Covenant. Once that's resolved, McRae casts a Mistmeadow Witch, and then passes. Bilal plays a Mountain, and then attacks Shawn for 3 with Aurelia, getting an additional combat step, and then attacking him for 3 more. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Apex Altasaur, fighting a creature when it enters, and also fighting another creature when it takes damage thanks to Enrage. This allows it to fight all of his opponent's creatures on board as long as it fights Niv-Mizzet last, killing them all and itself while drawing Shawn 5 total cards with Neith. Once the board wipe has resolved, he moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 6 with all of his creatures. McRae plays a Command Tower and then casts Culling Ritual, destroying all non-land permanents with mana value 2 or less, creating a black or green mana for each permanent destroyed this way, making a total of 6 mana. Then they recast their commander Niv-Mizzet, this time putting Rip Apart, Sylvan Reclamation, and Gloomshrieker into their hand. Finally, they cast their companion Jengatha the Wellspring and pass. On Bilal's turn, he simply draws and passes. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Defiler of Vigor, letting him pay 2 life for each green permanent spell he casts, making it cost 1 less if he does so, and then also putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures whenever he casts a green permanent spell. He also casts Garruk's Uprising, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures, giving his creatures trample, then drawing a card since he controls a creature with 4 or more power. After that, he casts an Ulvenwald Tracker, putting another counter on all of his creatures, and also casts Sakura Tribe Elder, putting yet another counter on all of his creatures. Finally, he moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 15 total damage with all of his creatures that can attack. McRae casts Gloomshrieker, returning Pernicious Deed from their graveyard to their hand when it enters, and they then cast the Pernicious Deed, which can destroy all non-land permanents with mana value less than or equal to the mana spent to activate it. They immediately activate it for 5, completely wiping the board. In response though, Shawn sacrifices his Sakura Tribe Elder to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then, once the board wipe is resolved, McRae casts Weathered Wayfarer and basic land cycles a Sylvan Reclamation, searching their library for a basic land and putting it into their hand. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Plains and passes. Shawn plays a Mountain and casts Elder Gargaroth, followed up by casting 3 Visits, searching his library for a forest and putting it into play tapped. McRae activates Weathered Wayfarer, searching their library for a land and putting it into their hand since Shawn controls more lands. This lets McRae get a Maze's End, playing it for the turn, making a zombie token, and then they recast their commander Niv-Mizzet, this time putting Hull Breach, Carter Doomscourge, Tatyova Benthic Druid, and Soul Herder into their hand when he enters. Bilal casts a Showdown of the Scalds, exiling the top 4 cards of his library and being able to play them until the end of his next turn. This lets him play a mountain and also cast Solar Blaze, making each creature do damage to itself equal to its power, wiping away all the creatures again. Shawn plays a mountain and recasts his commander Niv-Mizzet. McRae casts Carter Doomscourge, goading all of their opponent's creatures. They also cast Soul Herder, letting them exile a creature they control in their end step and return it to play. When Bilal draws for his turn, his Saga goes to Chapter 2, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever he casts a spell this turn. He then casts Flame Scroll Celebrant, doing 1 damage to an opponent when they activate a non-mana ability. He also casts a Worn Power Stone, putting a counter on the Flame Scroll Celebrant, and then plays a Needle Spires. Shawn plays a forest and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. Unfortunately, he also plays the land he put into his hand, accidentally making a second land drop for the turn. In response, McRae activates Maze's End, searching their library for a gate, putting it into play tapped, making a zombie token and returning Maze's End to their hand. Then Shawn casts End-Raze Forerunners, giving all his creatures +2/+2 and trample until the end of turn, and when he moves to combat, he activates Niv-Mizzet, doubling the Forerunner's power and toughness, attacking Bilal with both of his creatures for 19 total damage, knocking Bilal out of the game. McRae plays Maze's End, making another zombie token, then cast Fire Covenant, paying 10 life to do 10 damage divided among Shawn's creatures, killing both of them. After that, they cast a Baleful Strix, drawing a card when it enters, and also activate Basilisk Gate, giving Carter +6/+6 until the end of turn since they control 6 gates. This allows McRae to attack Shawn with Carter for 10, and at the end of turn, McRae exiles Carter, returning him to play and putting a +1/+1 counter on Soul Herder. Shawn casts a Goblin Anarchomancer, making his red and green spells cost 1 less to cast, then recasts his commander Niv-Mizzet. McRae casts Tatyova Benthic Druid, letting them draw a card and gain a life whenever they play a land. They also cast Rip Apart to do 3 damage to Niv-Mizzet, killing her. After that, they activate Basilisk Gate to give Baleful Strix +7/+7 and attack Shawn for 12 total damage with the Strix and 2 zombies. However, before damage, Shawn cast Beast Within to destroy the Strix and give McRae a 3/3 Beast token instead. Then Shawn takes 4 damage. At the end of turn, McRae activates Maze's End, searching their library for a gate, putting it into play tapped, drawing a card, gaining a life, and returning the Maze's End to their hand. On Shawn's turn, he recast Niv-Mizzet for the 5th time, then casts Kogla the Titan Ape, which fights Soul Herder when it enters, killing it and drawing Shawn a card. McRae replays the Maze's End, drawing a card, gaining a life, and making a zombie. They then activate Basilisk Gate, giving Carter +8/+8, and attack Shawn with everything except Tatyova. Shawn blocks Carter with the Anarchomancer, the Beast with Kogla, and a zombie with Niv-Mizzet, killing the Anarchomancer, Beast, and zombie while Shawn takes 4. Then, in McRae's second main phase, they recast their commander Niv-Mizzet, putting Boros Charm and Anguished Unmaking into their hand. Shawn plays a forest, then casts Epic Confrontation, having Kogla fight Tatyova, drawing a card with Niv-Mizzet. In response, though, McRae casts Boros Charm to give their permanents indestructible until the end of turn. At this point, Shawn realizes that he's dead on McRae's turn, so he decides to concede, winning McRae the game. Alright, so game 1, very sweet game. As you could probably guess, it didn't quite go the way that I was hoping for, so since it ended like that, I figured we may as well get a game 2 to see if our deck can do a little bit more of something. And in this case, we are actually joined by a completely brand new pod, and we are going to be playing today against Doodle, playing not only his first game on the channel, but his first game on Spell Table ever, so I am very excited to finally get a game in with Doodle. We've been talking about this for a while and just couldn't make it happen until now, and he is bringing Carter Doom Scourge to the table. We also have Nina playing Gissa and Geralf, and we have Lena playing Dina Soul Steeper. So starting off with Doodle's Carter deck, I have never played against a Carter deck specifically, although I've played against Carter multiple times. I mean, he even showed up in the last game that we just played. So I'm very interested to see how this works. I can't imagine there's a ton of ways to kind of abuse Carter's Enter the Battlefield abilities in Rakdos, although I imagine Doodle could probably find some ways. So since we're a combat-focused deck, I'm not super worried about Carter. I imagine if we get into a sticky situation, we just kind of take out Nina and Lena and then worry about Doodle, but we'll see how that goes. Next up, we have Nina and her Gissa and Geralf deck. So this is a zombie deck. She, of course, wants to play a ton of zombies, wants to get them out of the graveyard, make sure that, well, she's probably going to be doing reanimation better than we are, but hopefully we can give her a run for her money. And then finally, we have Lena and her Dina deck, and this is by far the deck that I am the most concerned about at the table. I have played against Lena's Dina deck before. I've built my own Dina deck. I know it can be incredibly powerful, and the fact that she can win by not really attacking, she can just kind of sit back and gain life and drain out her opponents, is a bit of a problem. As weird as it is, I think Carter might be the solution to this by forcing Dina to attack. Maybe someone can block her and kind of get her off the table, but this is definitely the deck that I am the most concerned about. We'll see how the game goes. I hope you all are excited for it. I know I am. I love playing against everyone in this pod, and honestly, the commanders look tons of fun. So let me know what you all think of the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Nina, Lena, and then myself. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Riveteer's Outlook, which sacrifices itself when it enters to search his library for a mountain, putting it into play tapped and gaining a life. Nina plays an Island. Lena plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1. I play a Mountain. Doodle plays an Akum Refuge, gaining a life. Nina plays a Swamp and casts Doomed Dissenter, which makes her a 2/2 zombie token when it dies. Lena plays a Swamp, then casts a Soul Ring, followed by casting Pristine Talisman, which gains her a life when it's tapped. I play a Mountain and cast Tormenting Voice, discarding a card to draw 2. Notably, I discard Anger, which gives all my creatures haste as long as it's in the graveyard and I control a mountain. Doodle plays a Foreboding Ruins, then casts a Felwar Stone. Nina plays a Swamp and casts Courier Bat, then moves to combat, attacking me for 1 with the Doomed Dissenter. Lena casts a Witherbloom Pledge Mage, letting her gain a life whenever she casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, also gaining a life for tapping her Talisman. Then she plays a Golgari Rot Farm, returning a Swamp to her hand. I play a Forest, then I cast a Goblin Anarchomancer, making all my green or red spells cost 1 less to cast. I move to combat, attacking Doodle for 2 with the Anarchomancer, and in my second main phase, I cast Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards. Doodle casts a Frontier Warmonger, giving any creatures that attack his opponents menace until the end of turn. Nina plays an Island and casts her commander Gissa and Geralf, milling herself for 4, letting her cast a zombie from her graveyard once each turn, then moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 2 with her bat. Lena plays a swamp and casts her commander, Dina Soul Steeper, making each opponent lose a life whenever she gains a life. Then she casts a Gluttonous Troll, making 3 food tokens since she has 3 opponents. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast Defiler of Vigor, letting me pay 2 life when I cast green permanent spells, making them cost 1 less if I do, and also letting me put a +1/+1 counter on all of my creatures whenever I cast a green permanent spell. I then move to combat and attack Nina for 6 since it has haste. Doodle casts a Mind Stone and also casts Soul Shatter, making each opponent sacrifice a creature they control with the highest mana value, killing Gissa and Geralf, Witherbloom Pledgemage, and Defiler of Vigor. Nina plays a swamp and casts Fairy Vandal, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever she draws her second card each turn. She then attacks Doodle for 2 in the air with her bat. Lena casts Tivash Gloom Summoner, which lets her pay life in her end step equal to the life she's gained this turn, making a demon token with power and toughness equal to the life she paid. She also gains a life with the Talisman, which triggers Dina, making each of her opponents lose a life. She also casts a Loxodon Warhammer, then at the end of turn she pays 1 life to make a 1/1 demon. I play a Mountain and cast Old One-Eye, making a 5/5 Tyrannid token and giving all my creatures trample. Then I move to combat, attacking Lena for 11. Doodle plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Carter Doomscourge, goading all of his opponent's creatures and also making each of his opponents lose a life whenever an attacking creature dies. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 4. Nina plays an island and recasts her commander, Gissa and Geralf, milling herself for 4, then, since she has to attack, she attacks me for 4 with all of her creatures. Lena casts an Arcane Signet and also casts Guillaume Master Chef, letting her make a food token in her end step for each creature that entered under her control this turn, and also lets her sacrifice a food to give another creature indestructible until the end of turn. She also specifically uses the Talisman, so she gains a life and each of her opponents lose a life. In response, Doodle casts a Terminate to destroy Tivash. Once that's resolved, Lena casts Rampant Growth, searching her library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then she attacks Nina for 4 with the Troll and the Demon, and attacks me for 1 with Dina. Then at the end of turn, she makes a food token thanks to Guillaume. I play a Path of Ancestry and cast Lightning Phoenix, followed by casting my commander, Gallia of the Endless Dance. Then, since I cast 2 creatures, Vengevine triggers from the graveyard, returning to play. Since all my creatures have to attack, I send 11 damage at Lena and 10 damage at Nina, also triggering Gallia's ability, letting me discard a card at random to draw 2. Doodle dashes in Flame Rush Rider, immediately going to combat, attacking me with the Warmonger, Rider, and Carter for 11, triggering the Rider and making a token copy of Carter that is tapped and attacking. The copy immediately dies due to the legend rule, but it does goad all of Doodle's opponents again, and also makes each of his opponents lose 2 life, since 2 Carters saw an attacking creature die. Then at the end of turn, the Rider returns to Doodle's hand. Nina plays an island and casts Hobbling Zombie from her graveyard, which creates a 2/2 zombie with Decayed when it dies. She also casts Steel-Clad Spirit, and moves to combat, attacking both Lena and I for 4. Lena casts a Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever she gains a life. Then she equips the Loxodon Warhammer to Dina, giving her +3/+0, Trample, and Lifelink. She also uses the Talisman to do so, gaining a life, making each opponent lose a life, and putting a counter on the Aerialist. She then attacks Nina for 8 and me for 5. Nina blocks Guillaume, killing both of her creatures to only take 3, while I take all 5 and Nina makes a zombie. Lena also sacrifices a food token to give Guillaume indestructible, letting him survive combat, and she also gains 4 life, making each opponent lose a life and putting a counter on the aerialist. Finally, in Lena's end step, she makes another food token with Guillaume. On my turn, I play a command tower and move to combat, attacking Nina for 10 and Lena for 11 with my entire board, since they're still forced to attack. This also triggers Gallia, letting me discard a card at random to draw 2 cards. Then in my second main phase, I cast a Skullwinder, letting Lena and I both put a card from our graveyard back into our hands, letting me get Defiler of Vigor while she gets Tavash. Once that's resolved, I recast the Defiler of Vigor and pass. Doodle casts a Soul Ring, then dashes in Flame Rush Rider. He also casts a Morbid Opportunist, letting him draw a card once per turn whenever a creature dies. He moves to combat, attacking Lena for 7, triggering the Rider, making a copy of Carter that immediately dies, goading each of Doodle's opponents, drawing him a card, and making each of his opponents lose 2 life. On Nina's turn, she plays an island, then attacks Lena for 4 and me for 8, knocking us both out of the game. Unfortunately, this doesn't stop Doodle from untapping and simply attacking Nina for lethal damage, winning Doodle the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I suppose let's start talking about game number 1 first. Obviously, as you may be able to guess, our deck didn't really do too much. I think you could see some of the sweet synergies that were going, but we got knocked out on turn 5 of a 15-turn game, so I felt that that wasn't a great showing of what our deck could do, which is what led us to the second game. But I still think that we did some cool things in game 1. And if we'd had a little bit more time, we probably could have done some very sweet things. We had the Vengevine in our graveyard, we had a Faithless Looting, so there was a way for us to kind of get our wheels rolling. We just didn't quite get there. Unfortunately, knocked out very early by Bilal's Aurelia, which looked very threatening very early on, especially with a lot of the quick mana and the fast mana that he had. I think that Bilal really ran out of steam very quickly after knocking me out of the game because he tended to just draw lands for a couple of turns and had no hand. So I think that if he'd been able to keep the momentum going, maybe draw some very powerful cards or even just things that let him keep attacking with Aurelia, there's a good chance that he probably could have won the game, but not quite in the cards for him. Shawn also did very well in this game, being able to fight down a ton of stuff. I was very impressed by Neith, particularly the Altasaur as well, that kind of came down and just wiped the board, was very, very impressive, and I'm honestly impressed by that card every single time I see it, so I would not be disappointed to play against Neith again in the future. And then, of course, got to talk about McRae. Their Gates deck did exactly what it wanted to do. They didn't get to win with Maze's End, which I know was a little bit disappointing, but still very cool nonetheless, just kind of being able to outgrind their opponents and slowly win through zombies and recasting Niv-Mizzet and the card draw that Niv-Mizzet provided. So very, very cool showing by all the decks at the table, and definitely very impressed by how they all performed, except unfortunately for ours, which is why we got a game 2. And I think in game 2, our deck performed a lot better. We didn't see as much reanimation, as weird as that is, in game 2. We just kind of played big, beefy creatures and kept swinging, which, unfortunately, because of Doodle's Carter deck, meant that we kept swinging at Nina and at Lena instead of at Doodle, so we couldn't quite take him down. Lena's Dina deck also did very well. She was able to sit back for the most part and just kind of gain life, but I was correct about the fact that Carter making Dina swing would be a hindrance to the overall strategy, so unfortunately didn't quite get to see all of the little synergies from Dina, but still very cool nonetheless. And then Nina's Gissa and Geralf deck, unfortunately she couldn't find a ton of zombies. She had a lot of her filler cards, which while very good, were not zombies, so she wasn't able to keep getting that synergy of casting them from the graveyard over and over, which I think would have helped quite a bit with the fact that we were goaded from Carter, but still put up a very good showing, and of course was able to knock out 2 other players, so that is saying quite a bit. And then finally, we of course got to talk about Doodle's Carter deck, a very sweet showing by Carter, and of course a win for Doodle in his very first spell table game, which was awesome to see. I think that if any of us had been able to find removal for Carter or for the Flame Rush Rider, we might have been able to stand a chance, but since none of us could quite deal with the new Carter every single turn, especially since the Rider got to dash in so we couldn't even remove it with a board wipe or anything like that, not exactly where we wanted to be, and I think it was very cool to see Carter kind of just lock the table down. And even though Doodle wasn't attacking for very much throughout the course of the game, being able to use his opponents to attack each other down and then finish it off at the end was very, very cool to see. So an awesome game. Both games definitely very sweet. I hope you all enjoyed them. If you did, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.
Great value.
Yeah,
Knockoff.
Great value. Geralt is just Gerald.
Is it Gerald or Geralt? Just like a gift
Oh,
for
hello.
Jeff.
I genuinely have no idea.
My name's Jeff. There's an Elaine! I can't tell the difference.
It is Elaine.
10 out of 10.
She looks just
Look
like
at her
the
little
cow.
hands.
Yeah, it's the exact same.
Hey. I mean, I can't tell the difference.
No.
Here you go.